Good evening. My name is Don Johnston, and on behalf of the Rae Dorough Speaker Series Board of Directors and the Bankhead Theater, I welcome you to tonight's live stream presentation featuring Maria Echaveste. While we regret that we could not host Maria in person in the intimacy of the Bankhead Theater, we are most grateful that she accepted to present via Zoom. Here is how we will proceed this evening. After I introduce our speaker, we will have 45 to 50 minutes of discussion before moving to questions. Your questions. We'll do our best to get to as many of your questions as time allows. Please remember that you can submit questions via chat at any time. We may answer some of your questions in the course of our discussion, and the rest we will try to answer at the conclusion of the program. Now, to introduce our speaker. Maria Echaveste is the president of the Opportunity Institute, a nonprofit focused on increasing social and economic mobility and advancing racial equity. Before that, she built a distinguished career working as a consultant, lecturer, senior White House official, longtime community leader, and corporate attorney. During her time in the administration of President Clinton, Echaveste served in a number of positions, including Assistant to the President and Deputy White House Chief of Staff. Echaveste received her BA from Stanford University and Doctor of Jurisprudence degree from UC Berkeley School of Law. And that's the short version of her very impressive resume. Maria Echaveste, welcome.
Oh, my pleasure to join everyone tonight.
Well, I think the elephant in the room today is that we are just 4 days out from the election. Many people believe it's one of the more important elections in modern times. Many of us are sitting on pins and needles. How are you living these last days up to the election?
Well, it's funny you should ask that. A day ago, I would have said, well, I'm just staying calm, trying to make sure that I can do what I can from where I live in the East Bay. And then all of a sudden this morning, I got this frantic call. Can I find some Spanish speaking volunteers to call into Pennsylvania because everybody's got to get their ballots in before 8 o'clock on Tuesday night. So it's a little hectic, and I think that there's plenty of work for all of us. And I think the most important thing, though, is if you know anybody who just doesn't think that their vote matters, your civic obligation, and I will say truly, whomever you vote for, it's about expressing your voice, because a representative democracy requires all of us participating. So that would be the most important thing, is just please, a civic obligation as a citizen of this country is to vote, express your views, whatever they may be.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned that you received a call, looking for help for people who speak Spanish and so forth. A lot of people believe that the Latino vote in this election will probably be more important than it has been in any election up till now. Do you have any insights as to what is your feeling about that?
Well, I think it's been, I've been around the block several decades now. And so when I worked on the 92 Clinton for President campaign, and I am dating myself here, but it was interesting because at the time, you kind of could figure it out. It was sort of Mexican Americans in the Southwest, Puerto Ricans in the Northeast, and Cuban Americans in Florida. Well, here we are decades later, and it's much more complicated. So you've got Puerto Ricans in both Pennsylvania and in the Orlando, Tampa area. You've got Central Americans in different parts of the country. So for those who know the Latino community, as I always say, it's racially, ethnically, linguistically, generationally, economically diverse. So there's no one strategy, which is why listening to this current election cycle, as folks have been trying to disentangle and understand the Latino vote, What is interesting is one of a consistent sort of Hispanic males, maybe 30% of them are supporting President Trump. What is that about? Where are Latinas? The gender gap, which is prevalent among all groups. So it's a little frustrating for me that we're still having this discussion about the diversity in the Latino community. On the other hand, I'm hoping that this election cycle will finally, convince the political operatives that the majority of Latinos speak English. So talk to them in English, not just Spanish. Oh, but yes, there are people who prefer to get their news in Spanish. So it's complicated. And by the way, let's not forget the Asian Pacific Islander community. There, the differences in languages, the differences in countries of origin, and though that's not as quite as dispersed around the country, the API work is very important in places like California, in the Central Valley, Nevada, also Georgia and Texas. So it's interesting, lots to dissect, lots to understand. And one hopes that we're not going to be waiting for days and days for what the results are, but there's going to be a lot to unpack and understand.
Well, just before I walked into the room this evening for our conversation here, I heard a piece on the television news that was saying that basically the gist of it was that young Latinos and Latinas are putting states that were not in play before in play, and the states they were citing were Texas and Arizona. Do you have any insight into that?
Oh, absolutely. And I think Arizona's a more, we've been watching that state for a number of years now. And by we, I mean, yes, I have a political hat and I'm a Democrat, served in a Democratic administration, but slowly the anti-immigrant attitudes and policies of 1070, which was sort of the Proposition 187 for Arizona, and also Sheriff Joe Arpaio, it really served as a mobilizing, motivating, organizing opportunity, especially for young people. And so there's a real, there was almost in 2016, there was a sense that Arizona could turn blue, but certainly this year there's a much more heightened optimism. And it's young Latinos are definitely, as young people everywhere, because that's another data point. Every election cycle, the political operatives talk about how we really need young people to vote and how can we get them to vote. And as Bernie Sanders discovered during the primary season, the young people didn't come quite out to vote that he was counting on. But it seems in this cycle, given what we're seeing in terms of early voting, that young people are coming out to vote. So as I said, we're on track right now for having a historic turnout among American voters, and women and young people seem to be driving a lot of that. So we shall see.
What are the critical issues that are driving certainly young Latinos and Latinas to be politically engaged in the way they are in this election, in a way perhaps that they were not in previous elections?
Yeah, I would say two things. And let me take a step back, because one of the things when you're in a political campaign, there's an effort to sort of break people into constituencies. Okay, women care about this. Men care about this. Latinos care about this issue, and Jews care about this. But what I've discovered, because I have been able to campaign across the country, is that people look to be respected and recognized for their unique stories, for their unique histories in our country. Just recognize that we are part of this quote that is America. But when you really talk to people, whether they're in Idaho or Oregon or Arizona, and I've been in the South, I've been in North Carolina, people really want the same thing. It's really astonishing. People want safe communities. They want good schools. They want decent jobs. They want to provide for their families. They want housing. They want healthcare. They want a dignified retirement. And I think that we forget when we think about constituencies that actually we all want the same thing. And what really vexes me is if people really want generally the same thing, how is it that we can't work together to compromise and get us to that place where we are making progress toward responding to people's needs? I mean, so there are real issues. If you're in the Midwest, manufacturing has taken a huge blow, and that is partly what led to Trump winning in 2016. He was speaking to certain people's concerns that were not being addressed in as forceful a way as people wanted. But we also know that globalization is not something that's like you're going to put a genie back into the bottle. It's not going to happen. So I will argue that President Trump's protectionist trade battles are not resulting in bringing back manufacturing jobs to the Midwest, for example. At the same time, I think some liberals and progressives are too quick to just say to middle America, well, too bad that you didn't get a higher education, have a universal basic income. No, that's not really a response, because work is about dignity and about feeling like you're providing for your family. So it's a long-winded way of saying the issues that Latinos care about are the same issues that Americans care about. It's about healthcare and it's about jobs. Now, they're overrepresented in low-paying jobs, dangerous jobs like agriculture, like meat packing, like janitorial, like restaurants that are closed now. So how you respond to those issues will be important. But education is something that all of us should care about. The reality is the majority of students in the state of California are increasingly Hispanic. Not something 20 to 40% are speak Spanish at home. So you have challenges in terms of education. There is no, as I like to say to my colleagues, there's plenty of work for all of us. Take an issue. There's something we ought to be finding a middle ground, a common ground, if we accept as a given that we as Americans, all of us deserve fairness under law, dignity and respect for our work, and to have an expectation that that our contributions to this country's economy will not be exploited, will be respected. So let me stop there.
Okay, I just wanted to ask you, because of course with the pandemic has highlighted a lot of other problems that we have, a lot of issues and so forth. And it's really animated a lot of voters, because these things have all of a sudden become comprehensible to a new, a broader population. How much do you think this is animating voters in this election? I mean, it would be kind of an irony that it's a pandemic where we're supposed to stay at home, but it's what is also driving us to try and change the country.
Well, I think the pandemic revealed for so many that you couldn't turn your eyes away from it, which is there's inequality and there are inequities that have been built up over decades, dare I say centuries. Because I wrote an essay maybe 10, 12 years ago for Maria Shriver, the former First Lady of California, had done a compilation of essays and analyses on the fact that women were now 50% of the workforce in American economy. The essay I wrote was Invisible but Essential, and it was focused on the way in which an immigrant workforce, the housekeepers, the nannies, the gardeners, were actually facilitating women joining the workforce. Now, today, we now recognize who's essential, right? It's those farm workers, it's those essential workers at the grocery stores. So the pandemic revealed the inequities in our economy, who was able to work safely from home and continue to draw a paycheck, and who is on the verge of being evicted from their homes because they can't pay the rent. And so this could be what the Great Depression led to. This could be a moment for America to take a strong look. What's the new social contract? I think now we all understand that everyone needs health insurance. And of course, the Supreme Court is going to be taking up the Affordable Care Act the week after next, and we shall see what happens. But we also see that because of the economic downturn, so many people lost their health insurance, right? So you've got a state like Texas that never expanded Medicaid. And yet the southern part of Texas has had very serious COVID deaths and illnesses. So I think that there's an opportunity here, but there's also, going back to sort of how we talked about this presentation, democracy, which is we've been fighting from the very founding of our country, the role of government. How much government do we want to impact our lives and our individual choices? And this has been a tension. And, we go back and forth. Unfortunately, the polarization that has happened over the last 10 to 15 years, I worry about whether we can find that middle ground and really believe that we have to find common ground if we're going to address some of these very, very deep challenges that we have. So
I'd like to hear from you a little bit about the Opportunity Institute, because you're working on a lot of these issues that we just talked about, the issues of social and economic mobility and racial equity. And of course, the key to those things is through providing educational opportunity. Talk to us a little bit about what the Institute does and how you work and how you've been affected by what we're going through now.
Well, I think first I want to start with why do I care so passionately about these issues of mobility and about the importance of access to a high quality education? And part of it is personal. So much of what a person ends up doing is it's motivated and formed by one's own experiences. And so I can speak as the daughter of immigrant parents who had no education from Mexico, who were farm workers, as the eldest of 7, growing up in the Central and Fresno and Ventura counties of the state. California at the time invested in public education in the top 5 of the 50 states. We invested in our public education system, not just K through 12, but right on through our CSU, community college, and the UC system. At this point, UC is it's less than 20%, maybe 15% funding from the state. And in our K-12 system, we're now in the bottom 5, 6 of the 50 states in terms of our investment in public education. And we can talk about Prop 13 and that impact. But the fact that I had received a high quality public education that prepared me to go to Stanford, and the state of California invested in me. I had a scholarship. I know the value of an education, and I feel so strongly, and this is what the work of the Opportunity Institute is. Every child is born with potential. They don't get to choose the family, the race, the gender, the zip code they're born into. Our society ought to be able to provide the opportunities in education so that that potential can be realized, and that the individual is empowered to make the choices that come from having a good education and deciding you want to be a poet or a musician. Fine. But maybe if you're going to a school, in our low income areas of this state where you don't have a computer science class. And by the way, we now know critically that the internet and digital, that's the future. And if you don't have that training or that opportunity to learn. So at OI, we are focused on finding those policies or practices that could be taken to scale to change systems. And one of them, and then I'll be quiet, goes to this question of how do you provide the supports and services for children who are suffering trauma, adversity, poverty, because now neuroscience tells us that those adverse childhood experiences impact a child's ability to learn. But it also tells us that the human brain is incredibly malleable. And with the right interventions, with the right supports, a child can learn and flourish with the right sort of mentoring and adult relationships. And maybe a parent is in jail. Can you find some other adult to help provide the kind of guidance and role modeling that can help a child aspire and see themselves on a different trajectory? So how do we get our systems, our mental health system, our healthcare system, our food security, how do we get all of that working together? And we think schools are a system that children and families for at least 12 years or more interact with. And no, we can't expect the education system to respond to every issue. They're not equipped. But can they be a gateway and entree point for accessing the services that are needed? So this framework is whole child equity. It's based on the science of learning and development. And we're working right now, California in the community schools context, in Mississippi at a local level, in New York at a state level, as well as in Illinois. And that's just one example of the work we're doing. We're small, and we believe in partnership because we need to collaborate with other organizations and allies. Plenty of work for all of us to do, just finding a place where we can add value to this, what I hope to be a march forward towards progress. So sorry for the long-winded answer, Don.
Well, no, but I mean, who are, you talked about the partners and allies. Who are some of the organizations, or who are some of the allies? Who are you looking to mobilize to help you accomplish these goals?
Well, I think it's really important to just remind everyone that we have a very decentralized education system in the United States. We are not France. We are not Europe, where you have a centralized Department of Education that controls curriculum and teaching and credentialing. We have federal, state, and then of course local. In California, we have 1,000 school districts. We have school boards, and we believe in local control. So for us, it is finding partners at the local level, working at the state level, whether we're in California, Ed Trust West, Public Advocates, ACLU of Southern California, Advancement Project. At the federal level, we've got American Institutes of Research, Learning Policy Institute, National Urban League. What you find is you need to identify a place where you can work together and contribute each of your strengths. And if anybody understands coalitional work, it sounds like it should be easy to do, but it takes energy working with partners. But I truly believe that we need to put our institutional interests a little bit to the side and keep focused on where we all want to go, and see, find those opportunities to make a systemic change that's informed by the work that's happening on the ground. Ultimately, you want to change what's happening in the classroom, at the school. You want to encourage schools to develop relationships with communities and families and have that trusting relationship. So if it sounds exhausting and complicated, it is. But I think there is no more important work, because what do we know? No one can ever take a good education away from you. You can, if you think in our country, why so many centuries ago you couldn't teach slaves to read or write, is because if you teach someone to be a critical thinker, they're going to be an advocate for themselves. And that is what we need in our country, is people who are empowered to engage in the civic life of our country to help it reflect our values, all of our values. So yeah, it's complicated.
Well, what are the forces that are resistant to making these kinds of changes? I mean, there are a variety of reasons of how we got here that are both policy and also economic, but what resistance are you meeting? What are the forces that are inhibiting your work?
I think there's at least two, and there's certainly more, but two that come to mind. One is it's an underlying framework that stands in the way of us achieving that common goal. And what do I mean by that? We have, in the same way I described this tension between the role of government, you combine that with the role of the individual. And so over the last, really starting with Reagan and a market-oriented framework that imbued public policy depending on who was controlling government, we've really gone to this one side of saying it's the individual's responsibility. Anybody can make it. You just have to work hard. And if you don't make it, then it's your fault. You're poor because you made the wrong decision. You dropped out of high school. You got married early. You didn't go on to college. And that framework that puts all the onus on the individual is attractive because it kind of relieves society, or a chunk of Americans, with it for any responsibility for the misfortune of others. At the same time, I want to be very clear. I don't believe government and society have a responsibility for everything. And there is a role for individual responsibility. And people do make poor decisions, and decisions that they live with, whether it's dealing with their stress through substance abuse, and if they're of a particular class, they feel like that what's the point of education? They're never going to get anywhere. Yes, there are a role for individual responsibility, but there's also societal responsibility, and that is what our tension is. So one is that framework. That's the resistance. There is just, and that shows up in the anti-tax attitude, in I'm not going to invest in public education. I'm not going to tax myself because those people, as is often said, aren't willing to work hard, aren't willing to study. That's a big source of the resistance. But I think the second is this ease with which Americans over decades find it easy to sort of us versus them. So I go back to California, right? Well, California taxed itself and then it stopped with Prop 13, just at a moment when its student population, the demographics of the state were changing. And there's a sense of sort of, well, those are not my children. Why do I have to worry about them? The ease with which we as human beings separate into us versus them, which is understandable. There's research about the way we make decisions, about the way we categorize, because of course, if your brain had to think every moment, okay, you categorize because that's how you get through the day. But you also bring to it experiences, and so you learn not to go to your immediate categorization. I see this tall Black man and assume he's a threat. But if you actually are aware of your own implicit bias, you realize, well, let me not make that assumption. I mean, I experienced that as a young lawyer working at a corporate law firm in Los Angeles in the early 80s, where everyone just assumed I was the secretary and would you please bring me coffee? Because why would I be a corporate lawyer? No one ever looked like me. I was at a firm of 200 lawyers and a handful of women and 3 people of color. So, but I think working in places like that gave other people experiences that helped them not make those kind of generalizations, those kind of categorizations. So going back to your question, I think the second area of resistance is making assumptions about particular groups' commitment to education, willingness to engage with the school system. The reality is, here's a factoid that everyone should really pay attention to. In 2015, California's Commission on Women and Girls does an analysis, issued its report. At that time, so this is 5 years ago, 2/3 of all the children born in this state were born to women with a high school education or less. 2/3. Now we know that's likely to mean majority of the kids are in poverty, maybe in single head of household. That has impacts for educational opportunity. So we need to really think, what can we do? Because that's our future workforce if we want to stay competitive in this global economy. So, there's so many things that connect to how do we make this. The American dream is partly a fantasy, except that you have examples like me that says like, yeah, it can happen, right? But it is happening less and less, and that I think is what we really should be asking ourselves. How do we make sure that that potential that exists in all human beings is able to be unlocked for the benefit of society, for art, for culture, for our civic life, for society, for science, for tech. I'll give you one other and then I'll be quiet. There's a noted neurosurgeon, Dr. John Quinones, who is at Johns Hopkins. He came undocumented to Fresno County Community College, went to Cal, ended up going to medical school. He has saved countless of people because of education. Like, how do we make that potential? We're just leaving human potential. We're leaving it untouched when we don't invest in education. So.
Well, my father was a teacher, and I remember his saying that at some point in this country, we stopped looking at education as an investment and we started looking at it as an expense, and that changed a lot of attitudes. I'd like to come back for a minute to what you were talking about a minute ago, because we were talking about the pandemic and how it's highlighted all of these issues. You were talking about bias and prejudice. I mean, we know from the Black Lives Matter movement, we saw all the things that have happened, and we know that that kind of discrimination affects not just African Americans or Blacks, it also affects Latinos and other minorities. I think for those of us who have had lives of privilege, we see some of the, we see on the surface what this bias and prejudice is, but we don't really see a lot of it is invisible to us. Just because it's outside the realm of our experience, and we don't, it's not a part of our daily lives in some way. And I think it would be of interest to our audience what some of those hidden biases are, and some of the things we should be more conscious of that would make us more sensitive to this. That's rather a convoluted question, but
you know, I think it's a complicated question because there's no easy answer. I think this, what happened after George Floyd's murder, which wasn't the last time an African-American male was killed by police, right? We've seen it since May. But it was a stark reflection of just how different systems react to certain people. And what it revealed is that how do European Americans, those whose roots come from Europe, but also people who are lighter skinned, let's just call it what it is. There is a colorism to our categorization of people. And this is true not just in our country, it is true in Asia, it is true in India, it is true in South America, Mexico. In Mexico, I am more dark-skinned, you know, I have some indigenous roots. You know, the southern part of Mexico is more indigenous, and the classism and the elitism in Mexico, but also, just take your pick. So there is a colorism. But that the fact that being darker may in fact cause law enforcement in particular to view you in a certain way. But it also means other systems, like I said, I became a lawyer in the early 80s when women were just beginning to be in the courtroom, become partners in law firms. Now women are more than 50% of the law students across the country. But it was a time in which the assumption was, no, women cannot be litigators. You can't go into a courtroom because you're a woman. So understanding that the lived experience may not be the same one as yours, and giving yourself permission to be open to the fact that the way you see the world may not be the only way to see the world. That, I think, is the challenge, right? We all bring our lived experiences to our work. I remember once in the White House, I used to run the wage and hour division at the Department of Labor. That's minimum wage, overtime, family medical leave. And we were having at the time, this is in 94, 95, a discussion about whether we should change the minimum wage laws to also overtime laws to allow for comp time, compensatory time. Rather than be paid time and a half, you could get time off of work, right? So in this White House meeting, there were people arguing, well, of course you should do comp time. That's, people want more time off of work, and they'd rather have that than money in their pocket. The people in that room, there were only two of us who had ever punched a time clock, right? You had people who were academics, who, you know, lawyers, you're working, you're getting paid on salary. Of course, you're not watching the clock. But if you punched a time clock in a kind of job like being a cashier, as I was in high school, those are tedious jobs, and getting overtime is actually, I'd rather have the money. So just having that experience that did not have to do with race, that did not have to do with gender, but just simply a different lived experience. That's important. So we now know from case study after case study in business schools that diversity around the corporate table in terms of experiences, being gender, racial, geography, helps you make better business decisions. So I think it's about being willing to acknowledge that you don't know everything, that your experience is not the end all and be all, and everyone did not have your experience. And it's kind of funny to say that, because of course that's natural. Nobody lived your life, nobody lived my life. But too often when you're around those proverbial policy-making tables, people forget that their experiences aren't the only ones that are relevant to the discussion. So it's really important to be open to other people's perspectives and to respect them and listen to them, really listen to them. And maybe you'll find that common area to make decisions. So, sorry.
No, it was that's a very interesting perspective, and we live in these deeply divided times where there's ideologically and politically, and yet, as you mention it now, a lot of people on both sides would have shared experience. It's just that doesn't tend to come to the fore in these situations.
Right. There's actually an effort. Joan Blade started, she was one of the founders of Move On, but she started something called Living Room Conversations, which I highly recommend, which was really an effort to get people on opposite political perspectives to have a civil discussion about criminal justice reform or gun control, just to understand each other's perspectives. Because I think we're not listening enough to each other. And yes, going back to race, I think it's really important. I mean, I have a daughter and a son who are African American, and I have watched them experience how the world looks at them and how they navigate a world that makes assumptions about them because they're Black, and how they navigate what the world says to them about being 5'9", my girl, and tall, and how her demeanor sometimes causes people to think that she's angry when she's not. She's just reserved, but they make assumptions. So I'm sorry I bring it so personal. It's just no getting away from the fact that society views certain people in a certain way, and that's very hard as an individual, especially if you're Black in this country. That stress, and constant stress of navigating how people are looking at you and what they're thinking about you when you go into a store, when you go to the drugstore, that adds stress. And actually some research has shown that's probably contributing to the higher maternal death rate of Black women in childbirth. The stress adds to their health indicators. So I think it's important to recognize that's real too. Mm-hmm. And I know there are people who just wish that I never see race. I'm colorblind. That is a disservice, and is I think almost a cop out, because it is ignoring the reality. Well, you think you don't see race, but actually what that person is living is very much impacted by their race.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about immigration. Of course, the president made immigration sort of a centerpiece of his campaign back in 2016. That's quieted down a little bit, but there's still a lot of media attention focused on all the problems at the border, the detention, the children being separated from their parents. And that receives a lot of attention, but there's been less attention paid to what has caused people to want to migrate from Central America and from Mexico. And I know that I think you're a fellow with the Central American Center at UC Berkeley. So I'd be interested in your perspective on that. We have, of course, there's climate change, corruption, lots of, problems in those countries. What should our country, what should the next administration, whichever it is, do to address some of those problems in those countries?
Well, let me start by saying I'm a senior fellow affiliated with the Center for Latin American Studies at UC Berkeley. But I have worked on the issues of immigration reform since the last year of the Clinton administration, when the 1996 law that was passed really impacted and created many of the problems we're experiencing now. So I want to say this about immigration. Human beings have been moving since the beginning of time, and they move in search of better opportunity. Yes, some people move because they are explorers and they just want to see what's on the other side of the ocean or the mountains. But the vast majority of people who find themselves risking their lives to cross oceans, cross the Mediterranean seas, put themselves in a hold of a Chinese boat, or cross the Sonoran Desert, are doing so because they're looking for a better life for themselves and their children. And it is that human spirit that we need to understand, that you can never truly just block immigration. People, that human spirit will not be denied. What we need to do, and what many of us have been working on since 2003 and 4, has been for a common sense management of immigration. Every country has the right to determine what terms and conditions you're going to let people in, and for how long, and for what purpose, and how many are you going to accept to actually become a permanent part of your country. No one, at least no one in this space, believes in this concept of open borders, because that's not the way we function. Every nation has a right to decide who comes in and who stays out. However, we need to understand the economic drivers, both the pull factor of jobs in this country, that is true. Farm work. The vast majority of the agricultural workforce picking our fruits and vegetables are foreign. And if you had a choice to work a minimum wage job, if you could get a job right now at McDonald's, you'd rather do that than be out in the hot sun in the Central Valley with 100-degree weather, even if you were making $14 an hour. So let's just understand that. But there's also the push factors of these countries with corruption, with lack of opportunity, they're not investing in their human capital. And our country has not done enough. It attempted in certain places, tried to invest in development in countries like El Salvador and Guatemala, but we can have a whole discussion on the interventions we made in Central America that made it worse, and which is why we had Central Americans leaving the violence and the wars, the dirty wars in Central America in the 80s. So our policies have not been as constructive as they could be, in part, and this is really important for us to understand. Up until this last 4 years, I would say, this country could pride itself on having strong institutions, institutions that could weather shifts in political winds. Congress, the executive branch, the judiciary, and the press, which is in part an institution. We've seen such an attack on the institutions of this country that one of the questions that we will be looking and ought to be looking at post this November and for the foreseeable future is whether our institutions are strong enough. Why do I raise that? Because what we didn't do in those countries, like Mexico, like Central America, and elsewhere around the planet, is really help build the institutions, the rule of law, the anti-corruption, the need for a strong press to hold elected and those in power accountable. Being a journalist in Mexico right now can get you killed. If you are writing stories about corruptions between this state governor and this narco trafficker, you are risking your life. So we have so much rebuilding to do at the State Department and in our diplomacy and in our efforts to help less developed countries. In order, most people want to stay in their own country. They really, really do. I always joke, I would always ask taxi drivers when I was back east, I would take a lot of taxis, and I would ask, they would ask me, where are you from? And I would say, I'm from California. And they would say, and I would say, where are you from? I'm from Ethiopia. I'm from, this area, Pakistan, whatever. And then they kept that, but where are you from? It turned out I have a face that makes them think that I was part of their country. And they just wanted to know, are your ethnic roots from my country, right? But then I would ask them, so are you planning to stay? What do you think? Oh, I'm just going to earn some money and then I'm going back home. I'm going back home. That is so many immigrants just want to work, get some capital. And I always joke that my parents did exactly what few people did. They worked here for 40 years and then they went back to Mexico, got their ranch, lived a quiet life. But they left us as Americans to be part of this country. And I say this story as an example that most people really don't want to leave their country if there is an opportunity for them. And in my case, and in so many immigrant families' cases, those opportunities were not there for their children or their future because their countries would not invest in them. And now in this country, we really have to challenge ourselves. Are we willing to invest in our people? Because a country really only has two things. It has its natural resources and it has its people. And if things get bad, even the people leave. And so we really, you're absolutely right, Don. We need to, you want to do something about illegal immigration, you have to invest in building the institutions that create opportunity and economic growth in the sending countries. That is truly the best way to reduce illegal immigration.
Well, we're starting to run out of time here, but I did want to ask you quickly a little bit about your experience working in the Clinton administration. Of course, there's been over the last 4 years a lot of attention paid. There's a lot of cynicism, but a lot of attention has been paid to the dysfunction in the White House. And I think our listeners would be interested in your insights into what a functioning White House looks like and what your experience was.
Well, number one, working at the very center of American government, the White House, is among the most stressful jobs that anyone can have. Why? because you never know what's going to happen. You could have a schedule, I'm going to work on this, and then suddenly you have the Los Alamos fire, and suddenly you have a potential. I remember one time, Hannaford, which is up in Washington, and there was a fire, and fires are all of our minds right now because we've had the worst fire season this year, right? But this Hannaford fire was right over where there were nuclear waste that was buried in the ground, and there for about, I want to say for about an hour, there was this real concern, like, are the canisters going to hold, or are we facing a just incredible disaster, right? Everything held, fine, controlled, but it's that. So I just want to, it's stressful. Okay, so how do you manage stress? I think those of us who've managed large organizations or just, it's about managing the stress. It's about having systems that allow you to make decisions with all the information that you can consider so that you can make good decisions, right? That we joke, the hard decisions go to the president because the easy ones staff can make, right? A cabinet member can make. So a White House that is functioning properly is one that is managing the information so that issues get distilled with the most salient points. Everybody's voices, you made an effort to get consensus and have a recommendation to the president, or you've teed up the pros and the cons and you present them to the president and you have a thoughtful exchange so that the president can make the hard decision. I think what I have observed, of course, outside the White House, but what is reported and the way decisions are made is that nothing of that sort has been happening in this White House. And that is terrifying to me, given the stresses of what is happening globally on any given day, and that the White House should be responding to or reacting to. And so I don't know how else to underscore that the lack of process and objectivity and systems to bring the pros and cons of particular issues to a president to make those hard decisions. Well, let's just be very clear. The pandemic, yes, President Trump did not cause the pandemic. You hear so many supporters of his say that it's not his fault. He did not cause it. But as the head of our government, to undermine the scientists, to undermine the possible ways to reduce the transmission of the virus, it's to me, it's beyond, it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy because we could have done so much better. And we're dealing with a second wave right now, and we're still seeing the simple act of wearing a mask as some sort of a statement about whether you're for freedom or not. As someone recently wrote, freedom is not about imposing your rights and beliefs to such an extent that it endangers other people. Freedom is about being responsible you have as much freedom until your fist hits my jaw, right? Like, there is a place where our freedoms need to respect each other, and I have a right not to endanger myself because you're not wearing a mask. So all of that, to me, and the way this pandemic has been handled, the way, if we're lucky and we have a vaccine and 6 months, 7 months, the way it's been politicized, we're going to have a huge challenge convincing people to take the vaccine, assuming it's safe. People aren't going to trust it. So there's been such, going back to the institution, tearing down of institutions. How do we get Americans to believe in their government when the current occupant has created such an alternate reality? And by the way, close to 40% of Americans believe that reality. So this is frightening to me, that the hardest job, truly, being president of this country is a very hard job. Staffing a president is a very hard job. It was also one of the honors of my life, because I believe in public service and really feel honored to have and privileged to have been able to serve our country. And so I am despondent is too light a word as I look at the dysfunction of this White House, and worry about how we restore faith in government. And this White House, there's no, like, it's comparing apples and oranges. I just don't recognize the way it's managed, Don.
Okay, one last question before we go to the questions from the audience, and forgive me for asking this, but would you ever consider serving in a Biden administration should he be elected, or serving in some capacity?
At the risk of sounding like I've been polishing up my resume, I would always answer the call for public service, because, as I said, it truly is a privilege and an honor. And frankly, there is so much work to be done at different level, at different agencies, at different capacities, that, when Clinton got elected, he brought a lot of people who had very little experience in federal government. And the first couple of years reflected that lack of experience. The good thing, should Biden get elected is, and I know there were a lot of people who wanted new faces, and I think you'll see them. You will see new faces. There's been real effort to bring in some of those other voices. And obviously the vice president nominee, Kamala Harris, is a new face, even though she's been in the Senate for several years. But still, you want a mix of experienced hands, so you don't have to figure out where the bathroom is. I literally remember the day I walked into the old executive office building on January 21, 1993, and it was empty. And literally, you're like, okay, where are the pencils? Where are the pads of paper? It'd be good to have people who knew their way around and could hit the ground running. And so, long-winded answer, Don, to saying, yes, of course I would serve if asked. Okay. But there are lots of people who are ready to serve. So I don't believe there'll be any lack of talent.
Right. Well, clearly you have a lot of valuable experience. Well, at this point, we'd like to move to our audience questions. So I'll start with those that have been submitted via chat. And the first question is, do you believe that the United States was ever the, quote, land of the free?
Oh, see, for some, and that's the thing. I think of our country as a work in progress. And I think it's really important. I am an optimist, because from our very foundings, people like me, people like my husband and my children would have been excluded from voting. And yet our founding documents gave us mechanisms to change our government, to have it be more representative, to have it be more inclusive, to give women the right to vote, to give voting rights to African Americans, to end segregation. But we're not finished with that work. And so did I ever, no, it was, yes, it was for some, a land of the free. But what bothers me sometimes is that there are folks who will say that if you're critical of America, that you don't love the country and you are denigrating our country. And I disagree with that attitude. I think that because I love this country, I want to help it be a better country. And that means recognizing its flaws and working to change them. So that's my answer, Don.
Okay. So this next question is, it's rather long-winded, but it says, those who are comfortable or prospering will want to return to the status quo post-COVID. For them to embrace change, they will have to recognize a better reality. What will a new reality look like that all can embrace? My grandparents were immigrants. They were welcome to the US. Now it seems as if an immigrant is not welcome. What do we need to address to get back to making immigrants feel welcome again?
I'd be really curious to, I've taught immigration law a number of times at the law school and also in undergrad here at Cal. And one of the things that I remind our students is actually very few immigrants were welcomed with open arms. If you look at our history, yes, we had indentured servants coming from Europe, from England. Then you had the first wave of Irish. But then if you ever saw Gangs of New York, you saw the battles between the first Irish settlers and the new ones who arrived from Ireland. And then, of course, we had the Southern Europeans coming, the Italians. And there was rejection. I mean, Ben Franklin, right? We think of Ben Franklin as this brilliant. He railed against the German immigrants. He was convinced they would never be good Americans. So I kind of disagree a little bit with that premise of whether immigrants were ever welcomed. They were welcome to do the work, but that does not mean they were welcome to be a full part of America. So I think recognizing that we have that history, yes, we're a nation of immigrants, but it doesn't mean we welcome them all the time. Okay, we need to, who do we need? Like I said before, what are the terms and conditions? And how do we, our first obligation as a government really should be to provide opportunity for those who are currently living in this country. And we could have a long discussion about the way employers and business used immigration as a way of, in the 10s and 20s, 1910s, 20s, to defeat unionizing efforts. So what we have to do is make a commitment to invest in our people, right? Really invest in the human capital that is within our borders, but also attract the talent and the energy of those outside the country in ways that are not displacing American workers and are not feeding that anti-immigrant attitude, but also are investing in those sending countries so that we're lifting all economies. I know that sounds very Pollyannish and probably decades in the making, but I do believe that there's a way to be pro-immigrant while being pro-American worker, and we have to find that balance.
Right. It's actually a nice segue into this next question, which is, tell us about how you overcame the feeling that, quote, I'm not as good or I don't belong.
When I arrived at Stanford, you understand, my mom took me on the Greyhound bus from Oxnard to Stanford. I never visited. I didn't know what it looked like, but okay. And I'm in Branner Hall. It's all a freshman dorm. And it's, just a handful of at the time, Chicanos, right? Mexican Americans, and there was two African Americans in the room next door, and Charles Lowry was convinced I was African American because he didn't know what a Mexican American looked like because he was from Cleveland, Ohio. So it was just this, and I did have that moment of, oh my goodness, what am I doing here? I would meet people and they would start singing Maria from West Side Story. Mind you, I had never seen the movie. So, so I'm like, I clearly, hadn't been to a Broadway show, hadn't been to a symphony. But I quickly realized that there were people down the hall who had life experiences very different from mine because they had the opportunity. And somehow I just latched onto that to not let that feeling of I don't belong here latch onto me, right? I just recognized they had an opportunity, doesn't make them better than me, doesn't make them smarter than me. They just had an opportunity that I didn't have growing up in Fresno and Oxnard. But over the years, what I also learned is there will be people, as I've said earlier, who will make judgments about what you can do as a woman, as a Latina. I remember once I was briefing a group of business people in the Roosevelt Room in the White House about our bankruptcy proposals reform. And I said to the audience, mostly male, mostly white business people, that I'd been a bankruptcy lawyer. And this person said, well, I assume you were a bankruptcy lawyer, you were representing debtors, I'm sure. And I looked at him, I said, no, actually, I was representing owners of airplanes. I represented airplane owners in airline bankruptcies. You made an assumption that because I was Latina, I must have only represented individual debtors in bankruptcy. And what I take from that is that their assumptions about what I know and what I can do is their problem. I know what I can do. I know what I've done. And therefore, I'm not going to let those preconceived judgments about what I can or can't do limit or get under my skin to make me feel less than. I'm just not. So is it arrogance? I don't think so. Is it self-confidence? Maybe a little bit. But I think it's fundamentally, I understand that people will make judgments, but I'm not going to, that is their problem, not my problem.
Okay, fair enough. Last question. Are you concerned that current closures of public schools may create a migration to private schools and an amplified argument for school vouchers and further divide?
Oh, I'm deeply, not only deeply concerned about the potential for driving towards private schools, but for the reality that for our most vulnerable children, they're on the verge of losing a year to 2 years of education. And how do we make it up? How do we provide the tutoring, the supports, going back to whole child equity that were needed beforehand, but now are exacerbated? As we all know, as we've read the stories, in terms of the digital divide, about not having a quiet place to work, about having to share a computer, all of that is impacting young children, elementary school, but I'm particularly worried about middle school and high school students. I just was having a conversation with a researcher who works with a collaboration of school superintendents in the state of California. And they're very concerned about the number of D's and F's they are giving out in these initial grading periods, partly because teachers are kind of teaching in the way they know how to teach without recognizing that maybe students aren't turning in their work for other reasons. a lot of those vulnerable children, families are their parents are out of work, they're suffering economically. There's this crisis in public education pre-existed COVID, but we have to take this crisis as an opportunity to transform how we provide whole child equity approach to education, because otherwise we're going to lose a generation. And we as the old saying, we don't have a human a mind to waste here. So yeah, I'm very concerned about these issues. And then of course I have the economic tsunami, the budget crunch that is happening, is going to happen. And as we put together the California budget this coming for next year, we've got a real crisis. Yeah, we have a lot of work to do here.
Well, that brings us to the end of our formal presentation. I mean, do you have any final parting shots for us? Or
I don't think parting shot is the right word. I would say, I want to underscore the optimism I feel. Yes, this is a pretty scary, stressful time, but I just want to remind folks that we've lived through other, I remember right after the 2016 election, I was sitting with a dear friend. She was 90-something at the time, and another friend, and we're sitting in DC, and he was consoling us by saying, remember, in '68, there were riots in the street. It was the Vietnam War. The country was really divided, and we got through it eventually. And I don't think he could have anticipated how hard the last 4 years have been and how more divided we are now. But I have to believe that the basic underpinnings of our democracy, that our institutions are strong enough to get us through this hard time, and that the basic decency of Americans in recognizing each other's dignity and right to be part of this American story, I have to believe we will get through this. It'll take a while. It's going to take a while, but I'm not going to give up on America at all. I'm not. And I hope you don't either.
No, well, thank you very much for that positive conclusion. Thank you so much for agreeing to present. There were a lot more questions I'd like to have gotten to, but I guess maybe we'll just have to have you back, maybe when times are a little bit different and we can compare notes a little bit. But thank you so much, Maria, for talking with us this evening.
Oh, I really enjoyed it, Don, and forgive me for going down a little bit down memory lane, but thank you so much for the conversation.
Those were some of the best parts, so thank you so much.
You.
Thank
All
you,
right.
Maria.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.